A spark in the skies. The sleek private jet shimmered on the tarmac under the golden glow of the setting sun, a testament to both engineering marvel and luxury. The hum of the engine harmonized with the soft breeze sweeping across the runway. Inside the opulent cabin, first-class accommodations were evident in every detail, from plush leather seats to walnut accents that gleamed under ambient lighting. The soft murmur of conversation among the staff painted a serene picture of readiness. Elijah Grant, a poised man in his early 40s, adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored gray suit as he settled into his usual seat by the window. His sharp features carried a calm demeanor, masking the storm of thoughts within. Elijah, the visionary behind the aviation company Altitude Lux, had spent years clawing his way up from obscurity to become a name synonymous with excellence in private travel. Every flight served as a quiet celebration of his resilience, a reminder that hard work could indeed break barriers. The jet was ready to board its passengers. Among those stepping on was Patricia Allington, a woman in her late 60s, adorned with jewels and a carefully curated air of affluence. Her stride was purposeful, her posture straight, and her gaze scanning the cabin with sharp precision. Patricia had inherited her wealth and title as a socialite, spending her days ensuring the world remembered her place among its elite. Her eyes landed briefly on Elijah before flickering away, but the seed of disapproval was planted. Elijah, preoccupied with the files displayed on his tablet, barely noticed her scrutiny. He had an important meeting in Chicago to finalize a groundbreaking merger that could elevate Altitude Lux to a global player in the aviation industry. But Patricia's thoughts were already swirling with indignation. She couldn't fathom how someone who didn't fit her narrow image of first-class clientele could sit so comfortably in her domain. As the other passengers filed in, Patricia continued to cast wary glances in Elijah's direction. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her designer handbag, as if clutching her sense of entitlement. The tension in her gaze went unnoticed by most, but it was palpable to the few seated nearby. By the time the plane doors closed, Patricia's patience was worn thin. Elijah, still oblivious to her brewing disdain, reviewed the financial projections on his screen. The hum of conversation gave way to the soothing monotone of safety instructions. Half an hour into the flight, the atmosphere in the cabin was calm, except for Patricia's growing agitation. She finally leaned toward the man sitting beside her, a corporate executive engrossed in his newspaper, and whispered, "I suppose standards have dropped. Look at that." She gestured subtly toward Elijah. The man looked up briefly, perplexed, and returned to his paper without comment. But Patricia wasn't one to let such injustices slide. Her carefully curated world had no room for anomalies, especially ones that threatened her perceived hierarchy. After another 10 minutes of silent brooding, she rose abruptly, her heels clicking loudly against the polished floor as she made her way to Elijah's seat. "You," Patricia declared, her voice sharp and commanding. Heads turned, and conversations hushed as her words pierced the cabin's tranquility. Elijah looked up, startled, meeting her fiery gaze. His initial confusion melted into a measured calm. "Is there something I can help you with?" he asked, his voice smooth and polite. "You don't belong here," Patricia stated bluntly, her tone heavy with presumption. "This section is for first-class passengers, not stowaways." The room fell into a tense silence. A few passengers exchanged awkward glances, unsure of how to intervene. The cabin crew froze mid-task, their professionalism momentarily betrayed by wide eyes. Elijah set his tablet down, taking a slow breath to steady himself. He'd encountered prejudice before, but seldom in such a brazen display. "I assure you, ma'am, I have every right to be here," he replied evenly. Patricia crossed her arms, her voice dripping with scorn. "Oh, really? And just how did you manage that? Some lottery ticket? Charity event?" Before Elijah could respond, a flight attendant hurried forward, her expression a mix of professionalism and concern. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, looking between Patricia and Elijah. "Yes," Patricia snapped. This man is clearly out of place. He has no business being in first class. The attendant turned to Elijah, who remained calm and composed. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" she asked. "Of course." Elijah reached into his jacket and handed it over without hesitation. The attendant examined it closely before returning it with an apologetic smile. "Mr. Grant," she addressed him formally, "your boarding pass is perfectly valid. Is there anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable?" Patricia's face twisted with disbelief. "This must be some mistake," she exclaimed. "There's no way." Elijah interrupted her, his voice firm but composed. "No mistake. And since you seem curious, I didn't just purchase a ticket for this flight. I also happen to be the owner of Altitude Lux, the airline you're flying with." The revelation sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. Murmurs of astonishment filled the air as passengers processed what had just transpired. Patricia's expression wavered between shock and mortification. You," she stammered, searching for words that wouldn't come. The confidence she wore like armor had cracked, exposing the fragility beneath. Elijah continued, his tone unwavering. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to." The flight attendant turned to Patricia, her tone more authoritative now. "Ma'am, I'll have to ask you to return to your seat. Any further disruption will be escalated." As Patricia retreated to her seat, the other passengers applauded quietly, a subtle show of solidarity and admiration for Elijah's grace under fire. The humiliated socialite sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Elijah picked up his tablet, but his mind lingered on the incident. He knew moments like this weren't isolated. They were symptoms of a much larger issue, one that needed addressing. This wasn't just about standing up for himself. It was about setting an example for those who might face similar prejudice. And Elijah wasn't the type to let things slide. The weight of reputation. Patricia slumped back into her seat, her cheeks blazing with embarrassment. The sharp eyes of the other passengers bore into her, though no one spoke. The quiet judgment in their gazes said everything she didn't want to hear. Her hands gripped the edges of her designer handbag like a lifeline, and her lips pressed together tightly to keep the flood of excuses and indignation at bay. How had the situation spiraled so far out of control? How had she, Patricia Allington, socialite, philanthropist, and epitome of class, ended up humiliated in front of strangers? Elijah, for his part, had resumed reviewing his files, but his mind was far from the merger awaiting him in Chicago. While his demeanor remained composed, Patricia's words echoed in his mind, dredging up memories of countless microaggressions and overt displays of bias he had faced on his journey to success. Moments like this were not new to him, but they always left a lingering sting. He glanced out the window, watching the clouds roll by. He thought of his parents, whose unwavering support and hard work had laid the foundation for his achievements. They had instilled in him the values of perseverance and dignity in the face of adversity. Elijah resolved that he wouldn't let Patricia's actions slide, not just for himself, but for the countless others who faced such prejudice daily without the platform or resources to fight back. Across the cabin, Patricia's humiliation turned to simmering anger. She had spent decades cultivating a reputation of untouchable refinement. Her exclusive charity events, her regular appearances in high society magazines, her carefully curated social circle, none of it prepared her for the idea that anyone, let alone a black man she'd misjudged, could put her in her place so publicly. Her mind raced as she considered how she might salvage her pride. She thought of the reporters she knew, the bloggers eager for any story she fed them. Perhaps she could twist this incident into something that painted her as a victim of misunderstanding, a charitable woman standing up for what she thought was right. Yes, that could work. After all, public perception was malleable when you had the right connections. As the flight progressed, Patricia leaned back in her seat and pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She considered crafting a post or sending a message to an editor friend. But before she could act, one of the cabin crew members approached her, carrying a note. Ms. Allington, the attendant said politely, Mr. Grant has requested that this be delivered to you. Patricia hesitated before taking the note. Unfolding the fine stationery, she read the carefully penned words. Ms. Allington, I would appreciate it if you refrained from attempting to escalate today's incident through media or other channels. It's important to note that your actions were witnessed by numerous passengers, and any attempt to spin the narrative will be met with facts. I'd also like to extend an invitation. If you're open to understanding why your actions were harmful, I would be willing to have a conversation with you. On neutral ground, of course. We cannot move forward as a society without confronting our biases. Sincerely, Elijah Grant. Patricia's grip on the note tightened as her eyes skimmed over it again. Was this a threat? An attempt to shame her further? Or worse, was it a genuine offer? She wasn't sure what infuriated her more, the audacity or the measured tone. For someone who had built her identity around being in control, this note was yet another reminder of how much power had slipped from her grasp. Meanwhile, Elijah considered his next steps. He wasn't naive. He knew Patricia's type well. She might appear defeated now, but her entitlement wouldn't allow her to let this go quietly. His team would already be preparing for potential fallout, ensuring the truth of the encounter was well documented and ready to counter any narrative she might attempt to spin. Still, he didn't want this to devolve into a public spectacle. He believed in addressing issues constructively when possible. He thought of his late mentor, James Porter, who had always told him, "People don't change when you fight them. They change when you make them see themselves clearly." Elijah hoped his invitation to dialogue would plant a seed, though he wasn't counting on Patricia taking the offer. Back on solid ground. By the time the jet touched down in Chicago, the tension in the cabin was almost palpable. Patricia avoided eye contact with Elijah and the other passengers as she gathered her belongings, her movements sharp and purposeful. The usual grace she carried was replaced by something jagged, desperation, perhaps. Elijah, on the other hand, moved with unhurried confidence, exchanging polite nods with the crew. As he disembarked, he saw Patricia linger near the entrance to the terminal, her phone pressed to her ear. She was speaking animatedly, her free hand gesturing as if trying to will the situation into her control. Damage control, Elijah murmured to himself with a wry smile. He shook his head and continued toward his waiting car. His assistant, Maya, greeted him with a brisk rundown of his upcoming schedule, but he stopped her mid-sentence. "Maya," he said, his voice serious, "get in touch with the PR team. I want to make sure everything from today's flight is documented. Passenger statements, crew accounts, everything. Let's stay ahead of this." Maya nodded, her expression shifting to one of quiet determination. On it, the social media storm. By the next morning, Patricia's version of events was circulating among certain corners of social media. Carefully worded posts described her as the target of intimidation and public humiliation by an overly entitled businessman who had been inappropriately confrontational. While her narrative avoided direct accusations, the implications were clear enough to ignite polarized reactions. But Elijah and his team had anticipated this. Within hours, his PR team released an official statement, backed by eyewitness accounts and even video clips discreetly captured by passengers. The evidence left no room for doubt about what had transpired. Elijah's calm demeanor in the face of Patricia's outburst became the focal point of the discussion, and Patricia's attempts to sway public opinion crumbled under the weight of the truth. Social media erupted in support of Elijah, with hashtags like #StandWithElijah and #EndEntitlement trending across platforms. Patricia's carefully constructed narrative disintegrated, leaving her reputation in tatters. A turning point. Elijah's actions sparked a broader conversation. Media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a watershed moment for addressing privilege and prejudice in elite spaces. Elijah, however, chose not to revel in the backlash against Patricia. Instead, he used the opportunity to promote meaningful dialogue. He announced a new initiative under Altitude Lux, a scholarship program aimed at training underrepresented youth for careers in aviation. "We rise by lifting others," he said in a televised interview, his voice steady and inspiring. Patricia, meanwhile, faced a reckoning. With her credibility shattered and her social standing diminished, she retreated from the public eye. The note Elijah had given her remained tucked in a drawer, unread after that flight, a silent reminder of her fall from grace. The winds of change. The morning air in Chicago was crisp, the city alive with the energy of commuters bustling to their destinations. For Elijah Grant, however, the day ahead was anything but routine. He had just finalized plans for a press conference to announce Altitude Lux's new initiative, a scholarship program designed to inspire a new generation of diverse aviators. The program was more than a business decision. It was a deeply personal mission. As Elijah sat in the sleek conference room at Altitude Lux's Chicago headquarters, his assistant, Maya, laid out the details. "The media turnout is strong. We've confirmed attendance from several major outlets. The narrative is in your favor, Elijah. People are ready to hear what you have to say." Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just about the narrative, Maya. It's about creating lasting impact. I want this initiative to show that we're not just addressing what happened on that flight, but the bigger picture, breaking down barriers in spaces where people like us are often excluded." Maya smiled, her admiration evident. "You've got this. Let me know if there's anything else you need." As Maya left the room, Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind drifting to the many obstacles he had faced to reach this point. He thought about his younger self, the boy from a modest neighborhood with big dreams and little support. He remembered his first aviation job, cleaning planes at a small regional airport. Those days were filled with long hours and even longer nights, studying for the certifications that would eventually allow him to soar, literally and metaphorically. Patricia's crossroads. Across town, in a penthouse that once buzzed with activity, Patricia Allington sat alone at her dining table. Her morning coffee sat untouched, the newspaper open to an article about Elijah Grant and his upcoming press conference. The headline read, "Breaking Barriers. Altitude Lux CEO launches bold new initiative." Patricia's eyes skimmed the page, the words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. The article detailed Elijah's journey from humble beginnings to a successful entrepreneur, as well as his calm, dignified response to her outburst on the flight. It painted him as a symbol of perseverance and change, a man turning a moment of prejudice into a movement for progress. Her chest tightened. The fallout from the incident had been swift and merciless. Invitations to exclusive events dwindled, partnerships dissolved, and whispers of her behavior echoed in the circles where her name had once been untouchable. She had always prided herself on her reputation, but now it felt like a fragile relic of the past. On the edge of her dining table sat the note Elijah had given her during the flight. She had tossed it aside that day, unwilling to entertain the idea of self-reflection. But now, in the solitude of her penthouse, the note seemed to taunt her. She reached for it, unfolding the crisp paper. As she reread Elijah's words, a pang of something unfamiliar coursed through her. Shame, perhaps, or the faint stirrings of regret. Was it possible that she had been wrong? The thought was almost unbearable, but the evidence was clear. Her actions on that flight had not just humiliated her, they had revealed the fragility of her worldview. Patricia set the note down and picked up her phone. For the first time in decades, she felt compelled to seek guidance rather than give it. The press conference. Elijah stood at the podium, a row of microphones angled toward him, the flash of cameras illuminating the room. The press conference had drawn a crowd larger than anyone had anticipated. Community leaders, aspiring pilots, and curious citizens filled the space, eager to hear his message. "Good morning," Elijah began, his voice calm yet commanding. "Today, I'm proud to announce a new chapter for Altitude Lux, one that reflects our commitment to fostering diversity and opportunity in the aviation industry." He paused, scanning the room. This scholarship program isn't just about giving financial aid. It's about breaking down barriers. It's about creating access to an industry that has historically been closed off to so many. We want to inspire young people from all walks of life to dream big and to know that those dreams are attainable. The audience broke into applause, but Elijah wasn't finished. I also want to take a moment to address something more personal. Last week, an incident on one of our flights brought attention to the prejudices that still exist in our society. While moments like that are disheartening, they also remind us of the work that still needs to be done. He paused again, his gaze steady. Change doesn't happen by waiting for it. It happens when we stand up, speak out, and take action. And that's exactly what we're doing here today. The applause this time was thunderous, accompanied by cheers from the crowd. Elijah stepped away from the podium, shaking hands with community leaders and answering questions from reporters. As he moved through the crowd, he noticed a familiar face standing near the back. Patricia. A quiet exchange. Patricia stood awkwardly near the exit, her usual confidence replaced with hesitation. She had no idea what had compelled her to come. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the gnawing feeling that she owed Elijah something, an explanation, an apology, or at least an acknowledgement of her actions. Elijah noticed her and approached, his expression neutral but his eyes observant. "Miss Allington," he said evenly, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Patricia hesitated, searching for the right words. "Mr. Grant, She stopped, unsure of how to proceed. The usual armor of entitlement felt useless here. "I read your note," she said finally, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "And I realized, I've been blind. Not just to you, but to so much. I came here today because I needed to see this for myself. To see you for who you are, not who I assumed you were." Elijah's expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened. "Acknowledgement is the first step," he replied. "What matters is what you do next." Patricia nodded, her gaze dropping briefly before meeting his again. "I'd like to learn more," she said, "if you're willing to have that conversation." Elijah considered her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I am. But it's not just a conversation, Ms. Allington. It's a commitment to listening, understanding, and acting. Are you ready for that?" Patricia didn't answer immediately, but her silence was contemplative, not defensive. Finally, she said, "I think I am." A seed of transformation. As the press conference concluded, Patricia lingered in the background, watching as Elijah engaged with attendees and the media. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't experienced in a long time: humility. Elijah, meanwhile, returned to his office with a renewed sense of purpose. The initiative was just the beginning. He had always believed that progress wasn't about grand gestures but about consistent effort. And if Patricia's presence was any indication, even the smallest steps could plant seeds for greater change. Ripples in the current. The story of Elijah Grant and Patricia Allington had moved from the confines of a private jet to the forefront of public conversation. Social media buzzed with debates, news outlets dissected the incident, and think pieces emerged, exploring everything from systemic bias in elite spaces to the importance of resilience and leadership. But for Elijah and Patricia, the journey was far from over. The events had only begun to ripple outward, affecting their lives and the lives of those around them in unexpected ways. Patricia's quiet resolve. For Patricia, the weeks following the press conference were a whirlwind of introspection. The isolation she felt was palpable. Friends who once flocked to her events now hesitated to call. Invitations to charity galas, previously abundant, had dried up. Her once sterling reputation had been tarnished, leaving her to confront a truth she had long ignored. Her privilege had shielded her from the consequences of her actions for far too long. She sat alone in her penthouse one evening, scrolling through social media. To her surprise, the hashtag Stand with Elijah had evolved into something larger. It wasn't just about the incident anymore. It was about celebrating stories of people breaking barriers and confronting prejudice. Young pilots shared their dreams under the hashtag. Activists used it to call for inclusivity in professional spaces, and ordinary people shared their experiences of overcoming bias. Patricia paused on a post by a young woman of color who had been inspired by Elijah's story to apply for aviation school. The woman wrote about her fear of rejection, her struggles with self-doubt, and how Elijah's calm dignity had emboldened her to try anyway. For the first time in years, Patricia felt something stir in her, a desire to be part of something meaningful rather than simply sitting atop a world she had inherited. Her mind wandered to Elijah's invitation for dialogue. She had reached out briefly at the press conference, but now she realized a single conversation wouldn't suffice. She needed to act, not just speak. Patricia opened her laptop and began researching racial equity organizations and workshops on confronting bias. If she was going to change, she needed to start with herself. Elijah's expanding vision. At Altitude Lux's headquarters, Elijah stood in the conference room with his leadership team. The success of the scholarship initiative had exceeded all expectations. Hundreds of applications had poured in from underrepresented communities across the country. But Elijah knew this was just the beginning. "We've built the framework," he said, pacing the room. "Now we need to make it sustainable. That means mentorship programs, partnerships with aviation schools, and internships. We're not just giving scholarships, we're creating career pipelines." One of his team members, Maya, chimed in. "We've already received inquiries from major airlines and aerospace companies interested in collaborating. This could grow into something much bigger than we anticipated." Elijah nodded. "Good, but let's make sure we stay true to the mission. This isn't just about PR. It's about making real, lasting change." The team got to work, brainstorming ideas for workshops, networking events, and even a documentary series highlighting the journeys of scholarship recipients. Elijah couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. What had begun as a reaction to prejudice was transforming into a movement, a meeting of minds. A week later, Patricia arrived at Altitude Lux's office for a scheduled meeting with Elijah. She had reached out through his assistant, expressing her desire to not only apologize, but also learn more about the initiatives he was spearheading. She arrived early, her nerves evident in the way she clutched her handbag. Elijah greeted her in the lobby, his demeanor polite but guarded. He had agreed to the meeting out of principle, but he wasn't sure what to expect. "Ms. Allington," he said, extending a hand. "Mr. Grant," Patricia replied, shaking his hand with an awkward smile. "Thank you for seeing me." They walked to a small conference room, where Patricia began, her voice uncharacteristically humble. "I wanted to start by apologizing again. What I did on that flight was inexcusable. I've spent the past few weeks reflecting on my behavior, and I realized how much of my life I've lived in a bubble, oblivious to the harm I might be causing." Elijah listened, his expression neutral. "Acknowledgement is important," he said, "but change takes more than words." Patricia nodded. "I understand that now. That's why I've started taking steps to educate myself. I've been attending workshops on bias and privilege, and I've donated to organizations working toward racial equity." Elijah leaned forward, intrigued but cautious. "And what do you hope to accomplish, Ms. Allington? Is this about repairing your reputation, or is it something deeper?" Patricia hesitated before answering. "I don't know where this journey will lead," she admitted, "but I know I can't go back to the way I was. I want to support the work you're doing, not to absolve myself, but because I believe it's the right thing to do." Elijah studied her for a moment, then nodded. "If you're serious about this, there are ways to get involved. But understand that this isn't a redemption tour. It's about committing to something bigger than yourself." "I understand," Patricia said earnestly. "A catalyst for change." Over the next few months, Patricia became a surprising ally to Elijah's initiatives. She used her connections to bring in influential donors and partners for the scholarship program, and she volunteered her time to mentor students, sharing the lessons she was learning about privilege and responsibility. Meanwhile, Altitude Lux's scholarship recipients began their journeys. One of the first recipients, a young man named Marcus, was a former mechanic who had dreamed of becoming a pilot, but never had the resources. Now he was training at a prestigious aviation school, his progress shared in a video series that inspired countless viewers. The initiative gained momentum, attracting attention from global aviation leaders. Elijah's vision expanded further, with plans to launch similar programs internationally. Each success was a step toward dismantling the barriers that had once held him and so many others back. A new legacy. At a gala celebrating the first class of scholarship recipients, Patricia sat quietly in the audience. She watched as Elijah took the stage to speak, his words resonating deeply with everyone in the room. "This isn't just about giving opportunities to a few," he said. "It's about creating a future where no one has to fight to prove they belong. It's about a world where we rise together, rather than holding each other down." The audience erupted in applause, but Patricia's focus remained on Elijah. She realized that his leadership wasn't just about his business or even his community. It was about redefining what it meant to lead with integrity. As the night went on, Patricia approached Elijah. "I never thought I'd say this," she said with a small smile. "But thank you for holding up a mirror when I needed it most." Elijah nodded, his expression warm. "The real work is just beginning, but it's worth it." Building bridges. The gala celebrating the first class of Altitude Lux scholarship recipients had ended on a high note, but the work was far from over. For Elijah Grant, the event was a milestone, not a finish line. The following morning, as he reviewed the gala's success in his office, his phone buzzed with notifications from media outlets, social media, and congratulatory messages. Each message reaffirmed that the movement he had started was resonating far beyond the confines of the aviation industry. But Elijah's mind was already on the next phase. He leaned back in his chair, watching the Chicago skyline through his window, and considered the broader implications of what he and his team had achieved. This wasn't just about aviation. It was about reshaping the way industries viewed diversity and access. Patricia's next steps. Across town, Patricia Allington sat at her desk, poring over the profiles of the scholarship recipients. She had taken it upon herself to sponsor one of the program's students, a young woman named Nadia who had overcome tremendous odds to pursue her dream of becoming a pilot. Patricia had spent hours on video calls with Nadia, learning about her journey and aspirations. Nadia's story was one of grit and determination, working 2 jobs to support her family while maintaining top grades in her high school STEM courses. Patricia found herself deeply moved by the young woman's resilience and ambition. For Patricia, this mentorship was more than just philanthropy, it was personal. Guiding Nadia reminded Patricia of her own father, a self-made entrepreneur who had once told her, "The mark of true success is not what you achieve, but how you help others rise." But Patricia also knew that her efforts wouldn't erase the past. She carried the weight of her actions on that flight, and while she had taken steps to change, she understood that redemption wasn't guaranteed. It had to be earned. Elijah expands the vision. Elijah sat with his leadership team, reviewing proposals for expanding the scholarship program. One idea stood out: a partnership with international aviation schools to offer similar scholarships globally. The proposal, spearheaded by Maya, outlined how Altitude Lux could collaborate with airlines and educational institutions to create a pipeline for underrepresented talent worldwide. "This is bold," Elijah said, his voice filled with admiration. "But it's exactly what we need. Let's make it happen." Maya grinned, her excitement evident. "I've already started reaching out to potential partners. The response has been overwhelmingly positive." Elijah leaned forward, his expression resolute. "Good. Let's take this to the next level. I want Altitude Lux to be more than just a company. I want it to be a catalyst for change." As the meeting ended, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something even bigger was on the horizon. He decided it was time to address the systemic issues in aviation head-on. The Industry Summit. A few months later, Elijah was invited to speak at an international aviation summit in London. The event was a gathering of industry leaders, policymakers, and innovators, all focused on the future of aviation. Elijah's keynote address was highly anticipated, as his recent initiatives had made him a rising star in the industry. When Elijah took the stage, the room fell silent. He began with a story about his early days in aviation, working as a mechanic and dreaming of one day piloting the very planes he serviced. He spoke about the barriers he faced, not just financial, but systemic biases that made it harder for people like him to succeed. "We've come a long way," Elijah said, his voice steady and commanding. "But let's not fool ourselves into thinking the work is done. Diversity isn't just about fairness, it's about strength. It's about bringing together the best minds, the best ideas, and the best talent from every corner of society." He outlined Altitude Lux's initiatives, emphasizing the tangible results they had achieved. "This is just the beginning," he concluded. "We have the power to create an industry that reflects the world we live in, a world where no dream is out of reach." The audience erupted into applause, and Elijah left the stage knowing his message had resonated. Afterward, he was approached by several CEOs of major airlines who expressed interest in adopting similar programs. The summit became a turning point, setting the stage for broader industry collaboration. Patricia's new role. Back in Chicago, Patricia found herself stepping into an unfamiliar but fulfilling role. Elijah had invited her to join the advisory board for Altitude Lux's scholarship program, a move that had surprised many, including Patricia herself. But Elijah saw her involvement as an opportunity for growth, both for Patricia and for the program. Patricia approached the role with a level of dedication she hadn't felt in years. She used her connections to secure funding, expand the program's reach, and advocate for systemic changes within the industry. Her mentorship of Nadia deepened, and she often found herself inspired by the young woman's drive. One evening, Patricia attended a board meeting where Nadia was presenting her progress. As Nadia spoke about her training and the challenges she had overcome, Patricia felt a surge of pride. She realized that helping someone else achieve their dreams was far more rewarding than any social accolade she had ever received. After the meeting, Patricia approached Elijah. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for giving me the chance to be part of this. It's changed me in ways I didn't think were possible." Elijah smiled, his tone warm but firm. "You've earned it, Patricia. But remember, this isn't about gratitude, it's about responsibility." A unified front. As the scholarship program continued to grow, so did its impact. Stories of the recipients, like Marcus, Nadia, and others, began to spread, inspiring people across industries to think differently about diversity and opportunity. Elijah's vision of Altitude Lux as a force for change was becoming a reality. At the same time, Patricia's transformation was evident to those around her. She had gone from a symbol of privilege and entitlement to a vocal advocate for equity and inclusion. While she knew she could never fully erase the mistakes of her past, she was determined to spend the rest of her life making amends. Together, Elijah and Patricia formed an unlikely partnership, one built on accountability, growth, and a shared commitment to creating a better future. Their collaboration became a model for how individuals and organizations could confront prejudice and build bridges, even in the face of deep divides. The legacy in flight. 2 years after the incident that had brought Elijah Grant and Patricia Allington into an unexpected alliance, the Altitude Lux Scholarship Initiative had grown beyond anyone's expectations. It was no longer just a corporate program. It was a global movement. The aviation industry, long criticized for its exclusivity, was beginning to embrace a new era of inclusivity and innovation. Elijah sat in his office at Altitude Lux's headquarters, looking out over the city skyline. His walls were adorned with photographs of the scholarship recipients, many of whom were now making waves in the aviation industry. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Maya stepped in with her usual efficiency. "Elijah," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. "You're going to want to see this." She handed him a tablet displaying a news headline. Altitude Lux Initiative spurs record enrollment in aviation programs worldwide. The article detailed how the scholarship program had inspired similar efforts across industries, from technology to engineering. Elijah leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. The ripple effects of their work were undeniable, but he knew there was still much to be done. Patricia's continued growth. Patricia, too, had found her stride. She had fully embraced her role on the advisory board and was now spearheading a new mentorship program aimed at preparing scholarship recipients for leadership roles in the aviation industry. Her transformation had been met with skepticism at first, but over time, she proved her commitment through consistent action. One afternoon, Patricia sat in a cafe with Nadia, the young woman she had mentored from the beginning. Nadia was now a licensed pilot, working for a regional airline and preparing to transition into a leadership position. "You've come so far," Patricia said, pride evident in her voice. "I can't take credit for your success, but I'm honored to have been part of your journey." Nadia smiled warmly. "You've done more than you know, Patricia. You've shown me that change is possible, not just for people like me, but for people like you." Patricia's chest tightened at the words. They were a reminder of the personal growth she had undergone, and of the responsibility she carried to continue that growth. A global summit. Later that year, Elijah and Patricia found themselves attending a global summit on diversity in aviation, held in Johannesburg. The summit was the first of its kind, bringing together leaders, activists, and aspiring professionals to discuss the future of the industry. Elijah was a featured speaker, his reputation as a trailblazer cemented by his work with Altitude Lux. As he took the stage, the room erupted in applause. He began by reflecting on his journey, but this time, he shifted the focus outward. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about the countless individuals who have been told, directly or indirectly, that they don't belong. It's about dismantling the barriers that prevent people from reaching their potential." He paused, scanning the audience. "We've made progress, but progress isn't permanent. It requires vigilance, effort, and the courage to challenge the status quo. And it requires all of us, together." After his speech, Patricia was invited to join a panel discussion on mentorship and allyship. Though she was initially nervous, she spoke with sincerity and humility, sharing her journey of self-awareness and growth. "Change is uncomfortable," she said, "but discomfort is where growth begins. I'm still learning every day, and I've realized that true allyship isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up, listening, and acting with integrity." The audience's response was overwhelming. Patricia's vulnerability resonated deeply, and many attendees approached her afterward to thank her for her honesty. The flight that changed everything. During the summit, Elijah and Patricia were approached by a young man named Ahmed, one of the newest scholarship recipients. Ahmed had grown up in a refugee camp and had faced unimaginable challenges on his path to becoming a pilot. "I just wanted to thank you both," Ahmed said, his voice filled with emotion. "Your work didn't just give me an opportunity, it gave me hope." Elijah and Patricia exchanged a glance, both moved by Ahmed's words. In that moment, they were reminded of why they had embarked on this journey. A lasting legacy. As the summit concluded, Elijah and Patricia returned to Chicago with a renewed sense of purpose. Over the following months, they continued to expand the scholarship initiative, creating partnerships with global organizations and launching new programs that reached even more communities. Elijah's vision for Altitude Lux as a force for good became a reality. The company was no longer just a luxury airline. It was a symbol of what was possible when businesses prioritized equity and innovation. Patricia, meanwhile, used her platform to advocate for systemic change across industries. She became a sought-after speaker, sharing her story of accountability and growth with audiences worldwide. Though she knew she could never fully undo her past, She was determined to spend the rest of her life building a better future. A flight to remember. 1 year later, Elijah and Patricia boarded a flight together, a routine trip for an industry conference. As they settled into their seats, Patricia glanced at Elijah with a wry smile. "Do you ever think about that first flight?" she asked. Elijah chuckled. "Every now and then. It's strange to think how much has changed since then." Patricia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's a reminder of how much further we have to go, but also of how far we've come." As the plane soared into the sky, Elijah looked out the window, watching the clouds drift by. For the first time in years, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The journey had been long and often challenging, but it had also been profoundly rewarding. Together, Elijah and Patricia had turned a moment of prejudice into a movement for progress, proving that even the most unlikely partnerships could build bridges, and that true change was always worth the effort.